Hi, everyone, and welcome to my show called We Were Lied to About 9/11. I am your host, John Gold, and this show is part of the Soapbox People's Network. This week, we're going to further discuss the 9/11 Commission, Philip Zelikow, Saudi Arabia, and a number of other issues and concerns.
Okay, this is John, and I'm here with Phil Shenon. How are you doing today, Phil?
Fine, John. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for being on. I'm going to quickly read your bio. Philip Shenon, the best-selling author of The Commission, The Uncensored History of the 9/11 Investigation, was a reporter for the New York Times for more than 20 years. As a Washington correspondent for the Times, he covered the Pentagon, the Justice Department, and the State Department. As a foreign correspondent for the paper, he reported for more than 60 countries, and several war zones. He lives in Washington, D.C. That's actually the shortest bio I've had to read so far. Anyway, all right, so let's get into the questions. What was the day of 9/11 like for you?
I was home watching television when the second plane went in, and obviously I thought at that moment that a terrorist attack was underway and that I had to get to work. I live several blocks away from the New York Times Washington Bureau, so I began the long trek in. And as I was going in, much of the city was trying to evacuate. I was going in, and lots of people were coming the other direction. So I spent most of that day, like every other journalist in Washington, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. And I do recall going to the White House shortly after I arrived at the Bureau just to see what the scene was. And again, it was one of utter panic with people trying to get away from the White House, to get away from downtown Washington on the assumption that another terrorist strike was coming.
Can you tell us a little bit about your history with the New York Times and how you came to be their reporter for the 9/11 Commission?
I began as a copy boy at the New York Times right out of college.
Wow.
I went to work as a copy boy to a columnist in the Washington Bureau by the name of James Arreston, who was the former executive editor in a real institution in Washington, and he was a fantastic boss. And I've always said it's kind of tragic that my very best boss was the one I had first off at the beginning of my career. But it was from there I worked my way up to being a Metro reporter in New York, and then back to the Washington Bureau, and then to several different posts overseas as a foreign correspondent. After working overseas for several years, I was sent back to the Washington Bureau, where I covered Congress and the State Department and the Pentagon. And when the 9/11 Commission was established, the decision was made by my editors in the Washington Bureau that they needed a full-time correspondent. And at that point, I think I was doing sort of general investigative projects, and they put me on it. I was actually kind of reluctant to take on the assignment of covering the 9/11 Commission, but it certainly proved to be one of the best assignments I would ever have.
Wow, so you were reluctant to do it. Did you attend every hearing, and what was your opinion of how the 9/11 Commission conducted itself publicly? And when I say that, I'm referring to things like the back and forth banter between commissioners and witnesses, and stuff like that, and not holding people under oath, and so on and so forth. Originally, the families had to shame them into holding people under oath. But what is your opinion of it?
Well, I think I attended most of the hearings. I certainly tried to attend all of the important ones. I will say, having covered Congress, that I thought by comparison to the way Congress holds public hearings, the 9/11 Commission didn't do a bad job. And there was this banter that could become very awkward among the commissioners, but it was fairly limited. I have criticism of the way they ran the public hearings, most importantly the hearing at which Condoleezza Rice testified, because she just played him for time and was really rarely asked a significant question that she gave a significant answer to.
Right, yes. Condoleezza Rice seemed to do a lot of evading that day.
She knew the time was limited, and her strategy clearly was when she was asked a question, she would drone on and on and on and on, eating up time, so she couldn't be asked the questions that the other commissioners wanted to address to her. Because, obviously she should have been a principal target of this investigation. Absolutely, and she committed perjury essentially, and should have been held accountable for that. They were talking about, and by the way, she started saying this when the August 6th PDB was first leaked, that the information was historical in nature and so on and so forth, but it was present tense information, and there were a lot of things that she said that could be considered to be a lie. Certainly she was accused of that at the time. And, I think the record shows that in the summer of 2001, there was a tremendous amount of intelligence information. The August 6th PDP was only part of it. But there was a tremendous amount of intelligence suggesting that a terrorist attack on American soil might be imminent. And a lot of that material ended up on her desk. And the question becomes, what did she do with that information? And the record shows she did remarkably little with that information. Well, as you say, it was the summer of threats, and the August 6th PDB got a lot of attention in the 9/11 Commission, and from what we've learned from Kurt Eichenwald, apparently the PDBs that came before it make the August 6th PDB pale by comparison as far as the stark warnings and so on and so forth. Well, I think in my book about the 9/11 Commission, I give a roster of the titles of all of the intelligence reports that came in that summer. And you're right, the August 6th PDB was only one of several that were, red alerts that something terrible was about to happen. Right. Did you talk to either the 9/11 Family Steering Committee or 9/11 Citizens Watch during the time of the 9/11 Commission? I get lost at a lot of the names of a lot of the family groups and the other groups that were operating at that time. I certainly think I spoke to most of the major advocates on the part of the families, and I certainly spoke to the Jersey girls in particular on a daily basis. Lori Van Auken actually told me that the family saw the banter that I spoke of as a waste of time when they could have been asking some of their questions. And it's funny, you brought up Condoleezza Rice, but before Condoleezza Rice testified, they sent in Richard Armitage in her stead, and some of the banter I was talking about, they were talking to him about basketball and stuff like that. Well, because Armitage didn't have the ability to answer a lot of the questions that he was being asked in her stead. He didn't know the answers. So that was really a wasted day. And, of course, what happened is that Richard Clark testified, and that blew up in the White House's face and Condoleezza Rice's face in particular, and she was then forced to testify. Right. And when Richard Armitage did testify, the Jersey girls and I think other family members walked out in protest. Right. I think their protest was principally focused on the fact they thought Condoleezza Rice should be sitting there, not Armitage. And Armitage, I think, did the best job he could under ridiculous circumstances. And, of course, what happened in the end is that the pressure built for Rice herself to testify. Well, I firmly believe that people like Richard Armitage are criminals, but, that's my opinion. At what point did you realize that there was a cover-up transpiring? Well, I'm not quite sure I know what you mean by cover-up. I mean, it was very clear to me from the earliest days that there were some terrible conflict of interest problems that this commission faced. Most importantly, the choice of Philip Zelikow as the executive director, since, I was startled on the day of his appointment to discover that he was a friend of Condoleezza Rice's. He'd written a book with her. What was this man who was a close friend of Condoleezza Rice's doing leading the day-to-day investigation, an investigation that should have made Condoleezza Rice in many ways a target? Well, the cover-up that I'm referring to, I mean, there are a multitude of cover-ups. I mean, every agency, every alphabet agency, essentially lied. You can look anywhere. You can look at the CIA about the information regarding the two hijackers in San Diego. They lied about that. You could look at the NSA,
who told the Joint Congressional Inquiry that it couldn't identify where the calls were coming from, from San Diego to Yemen, when in fact they did know the identities of the phone numbers of the hijackers. NORAD lied.
And clearly the 9/11 Commission believed that NORAD lied, and they also were very concerned about the truthfulness of George Tenet, the Director of Central Intelligence.
Right.
I can see where there were a number of discrete cover-ups going on.
Right. And, with regards to NORAD's cover-up, I think that staffers and members of the 9/11 Commission wanted to refer them to the Justice Department for a criminal investigation. But I think it was Philip Zelikow that actually got them to refer it to the Department of Justice Inspector General instead. The difference being that the Inspector General can't actually hold anyone accountable. They can only recommend that people be held accountable, whereas the Justice Department, could hold people accountable. And from what I read, I think it was Frank Rich who said that the Department of Defense Inspector General, during the time these investigations were taking place, was a corrupt individual. He was a Bush puppet of sorts.
I know, I haven't been in contact with these people for some time, but I know the staffers believed that, at the end of the day, this was a terrible whitewash by the Pentagon of real misconduct, including perjury by including people well up the ranks at the Pentagon. Certainly, there was a great deal of concern that there had been generals who had lied under oath to the 9/11 Commission about the events of the morning of the attacks.
Right, and this, unfortunately, we saw this all throughout the investigations, is that people lied, and we don't know the truth about a number of things as a result of that, and no one was held accountable.
Right. It is a thoroughly remarkable thing that all these years later, essentially nobody lost their jobs, nobody was even demoted as a result of what seems to be sort of blistering incompetence or worse, in the run-up to 9/11 and on the day itself.
Well, and not only were they not, but they were in some cases rewarded and promoted throughout government.
Absolutely.
And it makes no sense whatsoever. In fact, I think Thomas Keane at one point said that if it was his job, or if he was working in government or something to that effect, that there would be people in government that would no longer be there if he had an opinion on the subject.
Well, it's fine for him to say that, but of course he was instrumental in the decision on the 9/11 Commission not to hold individuals accountable.
Right.
Right.
At the very first public hearing, I think he said, "We're not here to point fingers." And when I spoke with Lori Van Auken, 9/11 family member Lori Van Auken, on this show, she told me that the families did expect, if people were to lie under oath, that the commission would have held them accountable. That's what the families were hoping for.
Sure. And they were, I remember the day of that hearing when Governor Keane announced that there would be no finger pointing, no personal accountability, and I remember how angry the families were that day.
Yeah, it's just horrible. What are some of the questions you still have about 9/11?
Oh, I have plenty of them. Principally, I think a big disclosure in my book that I've been kind of disappointed nobody's followed up on is the fact that there apparently is a vast record at the NSA, the National Security Agency, of files that document what was known about terrorist threats before 9/11, Al-Qaeda threats before 9/11. And the 9/11 Commission really bungled its handling of the NSA files. It really never got into depth with those files until the very last stages of the investigation. And as best I can tell, those files still have not been gone over all these years later.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. My last guest was NSA whistleblower Thomas Drake, and he is the one who testified before the Joint Congressional Inquiry that showed the smoking guns. He provided them with a report that showed the information that the NSA had prior to 9/11, and apparently all of those records have been destroyed, according to him. The only reference is that he did testify. That's the only information out there. But yes, as you said, the 9/11 Commission almost completely ignored the NSA. And I think it was you that wrote that it was sexier to concentrate on the CIA and stuff to that effect. And it was Philip Zelikow, essentially, that steered the commission away from the NSA. And then at the end of the 9/11 Commission, he made some kind of statement that said, yes, it's unfortunate that we might have missed some information. We just ran out of time. And I thought that it was interesting that he, of all people, would say that, considering it seemed to be him that was responsible for not going to the NSA.
Well, I don't know if I think the responsibilities probably belongs in several laps, but I was intrigued that he was ready to acknowledge that the commission had made a mistake by not going deeper into the NSA files. I thought that was a big concession on his part.
So what we found out last week was that the NSA had a ton of information about Al-Qaeda, about the 9/11 attacks, apparently. And who knows? We have no idea what was in those files.
And I'll say, in terms of cover-ups, my understanding, and I certainly put this in the book, was that the NSA was actually willing to cooperate. It sort of said to the 9/11 Commission, you can come to the NSA at Fort Meade, Maryland, you can go through all the materials, and that they were surprised that nobody showed up to do it. And it was only one particular member of the 9/11 Commission staff who blew the whistle at the end of the investigation and said, listen, most of the raw material in the government's files about terrorist threats is from the NSA, and why haven't we gone through that material? And it's only after she blew the whistle at the end of the investigation that there was this frantic weekend trip to the NSA to try to get into some of that material, but at that point it was too late, and most of that material wasn't reviewed and is not reflected in the 9/11 Commission's final report. What other questions I have? I, like everybody else, am fascinated to know what's in the famous 28 pages, because I have many questions about Saudi Arabian government involvement in Al-Qaeda and even possibly in the 9/11 plot. And these 28 pages apparently reflect some of the evidence of that, and of course that's still being denied to the public.
Well, we're going to get into that a little bit later. Now, you once told me that you were surprised that the, quote, 9/11 Truth Movement wasn't using your work to further its cause, and that indicates to me that you had sympathy for us and for what some of us were trying to do. Am I right about that?
I certainly support the efforts of the Truth Movement to force the government to release more of what's in the files. I was surprised after revealing what I revealed about the NSA files, the files that were not reviewed by the 9/11 Commission. I was surprised that the Truth Movement didn't jump on the idea of pressuring the government to release those files, or at least have somebody go back in there and take a look at them. And my book had a lot about this question of the Saudi government's possible involvement in Al-Qaeda, and what the 9/11 Commission knew and what it wasn't able to report in its final report. But and I was surprised that people didn't jump on what I disclosed about that to argue again for further disclosure.
Well, as I think you wrote, the NSA, when they opened their doors to the 9/11 Commission, you said perversely the 9/11 Commission to seem less interested. The more the NSA was willing, the less interested the 9/11 Commission seemed to be.
Well, as I understand it, the NSA was ready from the get-go to open its files to the 9/11 Commission, and it just didn't happen. And as you mentioned, in my book, it was told to me by members of the 9/11 Commission staff that there was this fixation on the CIA as this very, the sexy spy agency they wanted to investigate, and the NSA, which was perceived at that point as a bunch of sort of engineers and geeks, and just a less interesting place to try to understand. Times have changed, and the NSA is considered is a much sexier story than it was several years ago. But that was it. It seems to have been the idea was that it was just more interesting to investigate the CIA than the NSA, even though the NSA might have had much more valuable information to share with the investigation.
Well, and one of the interesting things is that some of the information they came across supposedly tied Iran or
No, that's actually what got the 9/11 Commission very interested right at the tail end of its investigation, is that this one staffer on the 9/11 Commission was going through some of the NSA documents and noticed that the NSA suggested there were ties between al-Qaeda and Iran, not Iraq, which had been the fixation of the Bush administration and so many others before, in that time period. And it was on the basis of that information about a possible Iranian tie to al-Qaeda that led the staff of the 9/11 Commission to try to get to some of the NSA files before the Commission closed its doors.
Well, I think Russ Baker, Gareth Porter, and I myself have written about the idea of Iran being connected to 9/11, and it just doesn't seem credible based on the information that we're aware of. Now, Dieter Snell, recently there was a lawsuit, and somebody was trying to blame Iran for 9/11. And Dieter Snell, who was one of the staffers, I think, on the 9/11 Commission, was a star witness for this courtroom. And at the end, the judge ruled that Iran had something to do with 9/11. And it's just ridiculous to me because Dieter Snell.
I say there. What I recall is that some of the documentation turned up by the 9/11 Commission at the tail end showed that some of the 9/11 hijackers had transited in and out of Iran and had been involved with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is tied into Iran. That for some reason the Iranian government had made life easier for some of the hijackers in the months and years leading up to the attacks. All I can tell you is that there was nothing to tie Iraq to al-Qaeda, but there was some evidence that might tie Iran to al-Qaeda. That's what I think those NSA files apparently showed.
Well, but from what I remember, simply the hijackers passed through Iran. They passed through Germany as well. So does that tie, Germany to the 9/11 attacks? They passed through Saudi Arabia, obviously. It just doesn't seem credible to me. And Iran has denied it on several occasions. In fact, President Ahmadinejad, when he was still in office, wrote a letter to Bush saying, we know we're being lied to about 9/11 and so on and so forth.
I wouldn't put my store in President Ahmadinejad's truthfulness.
I'm just saying. Go ahead.
Well, I say all I can tell you is that what the NSA shared with the 9/11 Commission at the tail end, or rather what the staff of the 9/11 Commission discovered at the tail end of the 9/11 Commission investigation, was that there was possibly a link between Iran and al-Qaeda, and it's a shame that they didn't know about that much earlier on during the investigation, because they would have had the chance to follow up. There was no more time to follow up.
Well, with regards to the 9/11 Truth Movement, I am aware that people started to give you a hard time because you weren't talking about controlled demolition or saying that 9/11 was an inside job. And I want you to know that I have used your work a lot. And I want to thank you for the tidbits that you did provide to us.
Well, I appreciate that. And I say that, I do think that I did disclose a lot about this turmoil within the staff of the 9/11 Commission and, Zeliko's role, which is something that also has not been widely followed up on in the wake of my book.
Oh, my goodness. I've tried to bring so much attention to Philip Zelikow because I think that, that's one thread that if you pulled on it, it could unravel the entire 9/11 cover-up. He was essentially in charge of the 9/11 Commission. Mm-hmm. He did a number of things, and several of them you wrote about. He wrote a complete outline with Ernest May of the final 9/11 report before the investigation even started, and they decided to keep that outline a secret from the staffers. Mm-hmm. With regards to Saudi Arabia's role, you wrote about how he blocked half of the investigation requests, that, he was making it difficult for individuals to gain access to the 28 redacted pages we were talking about, including...
He actually fired a staffer over...
Well, that exactly. Dana Leeseman, who went through a back channel to gain access to those 28 redacted pages. By the way, 28 redacted pages that I think she helped to author.
That's
because
correct.
she was part.
No,
she was part of the Joint Congressional Inquiry.
Right. No, she was one of the two authors of that document, as I understand it.
Yeah, it was Mike Jacobson and her, I believe.
Exactly.
And she, went through a back channel, and then Zelikow fired her. Mm-hmm. And you write about how he and Dieter Snell took part in a late-night editing session to remove Saudi support for the hijackers from the final 9/11 report, and they relegated it to a footnote in the back of the book. One thing you wrote about, and I have to ask you about this, in your book, you said that Philip Zelikow was sympathetic to the Saudi investigators, and just based on what I just went over, it seems contradictory to me.
That he was I'm losing you a bit. Well, I don't think the staffers had, on that particular issue, as I recall, the staffers, the lower-level staffers who were doing a lot of the actual digging, had just as much anxiety over Dieter Schnell, who was overseeing that part of the investigation, as they did with Zelikow.
Right.
But there was certainly a feeling that they had turned up a lot of very troubling evidence suggesting ties between the Saudi government and Al-Qaeda, and even possibly to the 9/11 attacks, and they were very angry that material did not go into the final report.
Right. And I don't know if you're aware, but the memorandums for the records that have been released, the MFRs from the 9/11 Commission, which are basically overviews of interviews done with witnesses. Prince Bandar's MFR is classified. In 3 of the MFRs having to do with people that are related to the Saudi side of things, it has specific statements calling into question the credibility of the witnesses that they're talking to, and yet the 9/11 report still absolved the government of Saudi Arabia. And with regards to the 28 redacted pages, Saudi Arabia is still pointing to the 9/11 Commission and saying, look, they cleared us.
The Saudis, to their credit, have actually called for the pages to be
right.
released.
I think, it's possible when they called for the release of the 28 redacted pages, I think they pretty much knew that they would not be released.
Right.
Now, with regards to the MFRs that I'm talking about, there were, 3 of the individuals that were interviewed. One of them was Osama bin Laden, and this is directly from his MFR. It says, quote, "The interview failed to yield any new information of note. Instead, in the writer's opinion, it established beyond cavil the witness' utter lack of credibility on virtually every material subject," end quote. Fahad al-Thumari says, quote, "Our general impression of Thumari is that he was deceptive during both interviews," end quote. And the last one is Saad al-Rashid, quote, "We believe that al-Rashid was being deceptive. Our impression that he has had enough time to develop a coherent story and is sticking to it, and that he even may be coached at some point," end quote.
Well, that's all to the credit of the staff of the 9/11 Commission, that they saw these guys as not telling the truth, and they wanted to report that.
Right, but even still, the 9/11 report absolved Saudi Arabia, even though things like that transpired. Now, are you aware of the efforts underway to get the 28 redacted pages of the Joint Congressional Inquiry into 9/11 released?
Yeah, no, I saw that, and there was a piece in the New Yorker magazine a couple of weeks ago about it. And I know that there's additional efforts to get them declassified, and it's bipartisan, which is intriguing.
Right, and unfortunately, there was an event that took place yesterday in New York City, and it got no press that I could see. I have a story. Are you aware of what the Obama administration has done with regards to Saudi Arabia and 9/11?
Only in the most general sense.
Well, okay. A little story. When Obama first came into office, one of the first things he did was have a meeting with 9/11 family members. And the purpose of the meeting was to discuss the closing of Gitmo. And while at that meeting, Kristen Brettweiser asked him to release the 28 redacted pages, and he said he would, and never got back to her. And then I think it was a week later, he used that that meeting with the families as the justification for sending more troops to Afghanistan. It was a reminder, a great reminder, something to that effect. And then about 5 months later, Alina Kagan, on behalf of the Obama administration, filed a brief with the Supreme Court asking them not to hear the case, essentially, of the families. So essentially they were siding with the Saudis over the 9/11 families. And 9/11 family member and Jersey girl, Kristen Bratweiser, said at the time, quote, "I find this reprehensible. One would have hoped that the Obama administration would have taken a different stance than the Bush administration. And you wonder what message this sends to victims of terrorism around the world," end quote. On May 30th, 2009, the victims' family members released 2 press releases. The first one states, quote, "Today, the Obama administration filed in the Supreme Court a document that expressed the administration's decision to stand with a group of Saudi princes and against the right of American citizens, 9/11 family members, to have our day in court. Let there be no doubt the filing was political in nature and it stands up as a betrayal of everyone who lost a loved one or was injured on September 11, 2001, end quote. The second statement says that, quote, "On the day that President Obama holds his first summit with Saudi Arabian King Abdullah in Riyadh, the 9/11 families united to bankrupt terrorism charged that recent actions by his administration would enable 5 of the king's closest relatives to escape accountability for their role in financing and materially supporting the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks," end quote. The second press release lists, quote, "allegations made in 2002 of the Saudi royal family sponsorship and support of al-Qaeda that the families believe have been ignored by the Obama administration," end quote. So basically, Obama has continued Bush's stance with regards to protecting Saudi Arabia. Now, at the end of last year, December 2013, there was a lower court that actually gave the families the right to sue some people in Saudi Arabia. I think they absolved like the bin Laden group and so forth. Like they can't sue like those people, but they can sue some people in Saudi Arabia. And just recently, I think it was in June, the Supreme Court let that decision stand. So right now, the families are trying to get the 28 redacted pages released so they can bring it into a courtroom. And as we talked about, the Saudis are going to point to the 9/11 report, which absolved them.
Well, but maybe with the release of the 28 pages, the world will be a different place because people will have evidence they don't now have.
Well, but I'm saying, like, just recently, Lawrence Wright wrote an article about the 28 redacted pages, and he cites Philip Zelikow, who said, I think he said wild accusations and so on, like he gave no credibility to the idea or the notion that the government of Saudi Arabia may have been involved. And it concerns me for the family's sake if they do bring this into court. The 9/11 Commission, it can't be looked at as credible, in my mind anyway. At least with regards to that, with regards to a number of other things, but especially with regards to that. You once told me that you were interested in the possible Pakistani ISI connection to 9/11. Do you still have questions about that?
Sure. I haven't revisited that issue in a long time, but obviously, Al-Qaeda had its training camps in Afghanistan. People used to reach those training camps through Pakistan, and it was always believed, as I understood it, that elements of the Pakistani intelligence agency were letting them go in and out of Afghanistan, and what ties were there between Pakistan and Al-Qaeda. The fact more recently that Osama bin Laden turned out to be living in Pakistan should give us real reason to wonder what has the Pakistani intelligence agency been up to all these years.
The story goes that then head of the ISI, Lieutenant General Mahmoud Ahmed, ordered Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh to wire transfer $100,000 to Mohammed Atta. and CNN reported on it 2 times, and then the story seemed to go away, and other people were put in place as the paymasters of 9/11. And meanwhile, Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh sits in jail in prison for the part he supposedly had to play with the murder of Daniel Pearl. And incidentally, Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh recently attempted suicide in his prison cell. And he's somebody I'd love to be able to talk to. Now, it's interesting to me that after CNN reported that he was the paymaster of 9/11, there was an indictment made against him in the latter part of 2001, but it had to do with a crime he committed like 6 years earlier or something to that effect. It's just interesting to me that it seems like they were interested in getting him, but they didn't want to tie him to 9/11, it seems.
I have no expertise on that, but I just think that the Pakistani ISI seemed to have been involved in a whole bunch of unsavory activities going back decades. They played a real double game with the United States, supposedly our allies, but often operating against the United States, certainly operating against the United States military. And that should be much better explored than it has been.
Well, they've also worked with the CIA.
I'd say it's a double game.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions about it. When the FBI talked to Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh, he said he didn't want to talk about his ties to the Pakistani ISI for fear of his life or the life of his family. Mm-hmm. And I've never seen anyone in government come forward and say, why these allegations are incorrect, that Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh, had nothing to do with 9/11, and here's why. I've never seen that. So I still have to me, if you look at the reporting on the issue, it seems that there's more reason to think that it did happen than not. And so it's just very interesting to me. Now, one of the biggest revelations in your book is that Karl Rove was speaking to the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, Philip Zelikow, during the time of the 9/11 Commission. Can you please tell us about the specifics of this allegation?
Well, it's complicated, but it was apparently known on the staff. It certainly was known to Philip Zelikow's secretary that Karl Rove called in a number of times during the course of the investigation. And when it became well known on the staff that Karl Rove was calling in, people were alarmed. What was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission doing on the phone with, the man often referred to as Bush's brain, Bush's chief political guru? What possible reason could those two men have to talk? And there's this odd situation in which Zelikow apparently calls in his secretary, closes the door and orders her not to keep a phone log any further of his contacts with the White House. And she is so alarmed by this that she goes to the general counsel of the 9/11 Commission, a guy by the name of Dan Marcus, and says, what should she do? She's just been told by Zelikow not to keep a record of his phone calls. And the general counsel, Dan Marcus, tells her just to ignore Zelikow's orders. I know that Dr. Zelikow later went on television to say that this was all a figment of somebody's imagination. There had been no phone logs. I can tell you that I've seen that phone log. Phone log, I guess it's your definition of the word log, but there is the secretary kept a record of Zelikow's phone calls, including these phone calls from Rove. There was a log to that degree. And, Zelikow has acknowledged, or went on to acknowledge, that he did talk to Rove. And the reason he talked to Rove was because of Zelikow's past work at the University of Virginia, where he was an historian, and that this was all very innocent. I can't tell you the content of the phone calls between Rove and Zelikow. I can just tell you that when the staff of the 9/11 Commission found out that Zelikow was on the phone with Rove, there was a huge sense of shock and alarm.
Well, he shouldn't have been talking to him at all. The 9/11 Commission was supposed to be this nonpartisan or bipartisan effort. And here we have the executive director of the 9/11 Commission speaking with the White House Chief of Staff and telling people not to record his phone calls. And as you mentioned on television, he contradicted himself. He said, quote, "2 of the 3 people that took my calls," end quote. And then he says, quote, "the commission had no phone logs." So he's contradicting himself, essentially. He's playing semantics. There were no official, quote, 9/11 Commission phone logs.
Well,
but he had 3 people taking his messages.
Well, it seemed crazy, the idea that there weren't, so nobody was recording phone messages when they came, and of course they were. And I've seen the page of the log in which the secretary recorded these phone calls from Roe. And, it's not just the secretary who offers this story. She protested to the general counsel of the commission about this, and I think if you look at the record, neither the secretary nor the general counsel have denied the accuracy of that story in my book.
Well, I honestly believe that Philip Zelikow needs to be put on a stand under oath to take questions, and if he lies under oath, then he should be held accountable. I think he's a criminal. I think he belongs in jail. You might disagree with me, but he was instrumental in making sure that the real truth of 9/11 was never told. And you know what? For Karl Rove, I think he was like an architect of the 9/11 Commission, wasn't he? Didn't he select Thomas Keane?
Yes. No. He was certainly in on the decision to select Keane, and I believe he was in on the decision initially to have Henry Kissinger.
Right. Exactly. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Now, you once wrote an article entitled, quote, "They Knew But Did Nothing," for the Sydney Morning Herald. What are some of the indications that you are aware of that they, quote, knew about the impending attacks?
Well, that was actually an excerpt of my book. So it offered the chapter of my book in which I reported that in the summer of threat, these intelligence warnings came in, daily, almost hourly, warning the White House, warning the National Security Council that there was a dire terrorist threat that summer, and somebody needs to get on top of it to try to preempt it. And it's clear that the White House unhappily did precious little with that information. So that's what I talk about. That's what they knew. They knew in the sense they had these intelligence reports of an imminent terrorist strike, and they did remarkably little with that information.
Well, from what I've read, some of the neocons within the Bush administration were actually telling Bush that the threats concerning Osama bin Laden were disinformation, and the real threat is Iraq.
Well, you have to remember that in this time period, the Bush White House was not. They didn't seem terribly interested in the threat of Al Qaeda. They were much more alarmed by the axis of evil. They were concerned by North Korea and Iran, and most importantly Iraq.
Well, from what I've read, their main focus was Iraq and partly Afghanistan to a certain extent. Now, my last question is a difficult question, but it's a hurdle that a lot of people face, so I'm just going to ask you. Regardless of whether or not you think the evidence is there to support this, do you think it's possible that elements within our government and other governments may have been criminally complicit in the attacks? Could people be capable of such a thing?
I just have not seen any credible evidence of it. I certainly hear that allegation made.
That's not what I'm not asking whether or not you think the evidence is there. I'm just asking, do you think that it is possible for elements within our government to do something like that?
I mean, anything is possible. But it's not my job to report what is possible in this world, because everything is possible. I can only, if I saw credible evidence of it, I would have reported it. It would have been the story of the decade, the story of my lifetime. I just didn't see it.
Right, and it's unfortunate. I think information out there exists that suggests such a thing.
Well, let me ask you a question. What is that information? Give me one clear example of it.
one clear example of criminal complicity? Well, okay, look at Alex Station. Doug Miller, 2 FBI agents were stationed to Alex Station, which was the CIA's bin Laden group. And one of the FBI agents wanted to send a warning to the FBI, letting them know that one of the hijackers had a U.S. visa. And under orders from Tom Wilshire, somebody blocked the cable that the FBI agent wanted to send. And then hours later, sends out a cable to the CIA saying that the FBI has been notified. That just seems like criminal behavior to me. I don't know for sure. One of the things that I do is I admit that I don't know what happened on 9/11 or who was ultimately responsible. It just seems that there are instances within the government that people were trying to do their jobs and they started to be blocked at the highest levels from doing their job. One of the things that... But
it's your suggestion, though, that they were being blocked from doing their jobs because somebody wanted the terrorist attack to take place on 9/11?
It seems that way to me.
I mean, I certainly heard the allegation made that people were blocking action before 9/11 because they were trying to protect perhaps some of the hijackers, because the hijackers were somehow government informants.
Well, that's one of the theories.
I've heard that theory offered, and I think there was a flap over some comments that Richard Clarke made in recent years about that. But again, inside involvement that 9/11 was an effort by elements of the United States government to carry out that attack. I certainly would like to believe that wouldn't be the case, and I certainly haven't seen any credible evidence to show it was the case.
I don't think people should undercut the notion, though, that it might be possible, and that might be why there are so many cover-ups. And when I look at the Bush administration, they were more than willing. They helped to rewrite EPA reports that put thousands of people in New York in danger, and now thousands of 9/11 first responders are sick, and over 1,000 have died. They were more than willing to lie us into war, which resulted in thousands of our soldiers being killed and upwards of 1.25 million Iraqis dead. I mean, it just seems like they would have no problems killing 3,000 people, considering what other actions they've done. Maybe I'm wrong. It is possible I'm wrong to think such a thing. I don't know. And I wish I did know, Phil. I really do. All right.
Okay, but I'm with you. I'm with you in the sense that I do believe that anything is possible. But I think the business that I'm in requires me to not report everything that is possible, but to report what I can. And I think the evidence that I offered in that book and elsewhere at least gives some evidence to people like you to demand further release of information about what exactly the government knew and what it was doing before 9/11.
Well, and that's another thing. The 9/11 Commission released, I think it was 35% of the documents that they had, and that they're still holding so much more. And many of the documents that they have been released are greatly redacted. So we have the 28 redacted pages of the joint.
I don't think that was a decision of the 9/11 Commission, though. And I think I've heard.
No, it wasn't.
Right, and I think I've heard recently that Kane and Hamilton have called for the release of more of the documents, including the 28 pages.
Yes, in fact, I'm the one that posted the video of them saying that. I understand.
That's all a step forward.
Right. Well, but it's not happening. All right, my very last question for you, and I understand that you just wrote a book. I read a review of the book. I haven't read the book yet. You recently released a book on the JFK assassination. Can you please tell us about this?
Sure. Well, actually, that book, I was taken to that book by my first book. The first book was about the 9/11 Commission. After that book came out, I got a phone call at my desk in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times from a prominent American lawyer who'd begun his career almost 50 years earlier on the other great Blue Ribbon Commission investigation of our lifetimes, which was the Warren Commission. And he said, wouldn't you like to do a similar book about the Warren Commission? And he promised to help me meet all the staffers who were still alive who participated in that investigation. So off I went, and that was supposed to be sort of an insider's history of the Warren Commission. It became a much larger book because I kept discovering evidence about the assassination that had not been revealed to the Warren Commission, that had been covered up, to some extent shades of 9/11. And the discovery at the end of the research on the Kennedy book was that is the large discovery in my own mind that the two great national tragedies of my lifetime, the Kennedy assassination and 9/11, just did not have to happen. There was more than enough intelligence and government files before those two awful incidents to have allowed the government to preempt them, but a combination of incompetence and laziness prevented that from happening.
So your position is that incompetence or neglect is why you think Lee Harvey Oswald was the shooter? I don't know.
I think all the most credible evidence points to him as the shooter. But the question is who else knew about. Oswald was portrayed by the Warren Commission as, a total lone wolf, that nobody knew what he was going to do, nobody could have predicted what he was going to do, nobody helped him do what he was going to do. And in doing the research on my book, I think I found evidence to suggest that people did know what Oswald was going to do, that he talked openly about it, and that some of those people may have encouraged him to go to Dallas to do what he did.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not a JFK expert as much as I am a 9/11 expert, but I think there was something in the 70s that there was an investigation that found there was more than one shooter. Is that right?
Well, John, we'll be on this for hours if we go down that path. There was an investigation by Congress, by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and they were pretty much going to support the Warren Commission report until the final stages of that investigation. There was some acoustical evidence produced at the final stages to suggest there was a second gunman in Dealey Plaza. Subsequent analysis by lots and lots and lots of very credible scientists showed that acoustical evidence was wrong. And my understanding is that all the most credible evidence points to one shooter in Dealey Plaza, and that was Lee Harvey Oswald. But that doesn't mean there wasn't a conspiracy, though, because if people knew what Oswald was going to do and encouraged him to do what he was going to do and helped him, promised him help if he was ever able to carry it out, you were talking about, by legal definition, a conspiracy.
Well, so from what I've read, the book basically focuses on the commission was a lot like the 9/11 commission and how much of a cover-up or whitewash it was.
Well,
to me, there's an old saying, it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. And there are just so many examples of people lying, of people, attempting to hide information or to cover up information. There's so many.
It is even more clear-cut in the case of the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission. It's very clear that there were cover-ups, there were lots of lies told under oath. And we're all paying the price for that today because, all that cover-up resulted in all the conspiracy theories we're now confronted with.
Well, I don't know. See, to me, the phrase conspiracy theory is it's a phrase used by the establishment to silence and or discredit dissent. Like, if the corporate media over the last 10 years has done its very best to paint people like me, who's an advocate for 9/11 justice, who supports the families seeking 9/11 justice, who supported the 9/11 first responders seeking health care. They were painting people like me as no different as, a baby killer or a dog torturer. If you even say truther today or 9/11 truther, people cringe because of the campaign of the corporate media over the years. And the phrase conspiracy theory, I think, was first brought about because of the JFK assassination.
Well, I think it goes back much further than that. There were conspiracy theories about, Lincoln and Julie. I think that phrase has been around for a long time, well before Kennedy, but it obviously really took flight after the Kennedy assassination.
Right. I hope someday that, we have truth. I hope that there is some form of accountability with regards to the 9/11 attacks. I hope that the war on terror ends. This perpetual war can't continue. I just can't imagine being a family member, like one of the Jersey girls, who knows everything that we do and has had to watch the names of their loved ones used to do all these horrible things around the world, all the while not knowing, exactly what happened, who is responsible, and so on and so forth. When you try to put yourself in their shoes, it's just unimaginable. At least to me, it's unimaginable.
I agree, and that's why I dedicated my first book to the 9/11 families and their quest for the truth, because it was clear to me that they did not have the full truth at that point.
I hope that, maybe you start pushing in your articles for the release of things like the 28 redacted pages or the documents from the 9/11 Commission in some of your, articles in the future.
And I think if you take a look at that, if you take a look at the piece in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago, the author actually credits me in my book for making clear why that information should be made public.
Right. Excellent. Well, Phil, this is a long time coming. I've known you. We've corresponded for years through email. This is actually the first time we've ever spoken on the phone that I know of. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for your time today, and I hope to hear from you again, and good luck with all of your endeavors, and especially with your new book. And thanks for taking the time today.
Great, John. My pleasure.
All right, Phil. Have a good day.
Thanks a lot, John. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.